talk to you about this morning is this idea of creating shared value. And I think it's a very powerful idea, and it's very gratifying that people here and all over the world are talking about this idea. But I have to tell you honestly, most people don't understand it. Most people think that when we talk about creating shared value, we're talking about shared values, the personal values that we might have as business leaders or as community members or as government members. And that's not what we mean. Other people think we're talking about sharing the value that has already been created in terms of more philanthropy or taking less profit. But that's not what we mean either. And other people think this is just the new fancier word for CSR, corporate social responsibility, or for philanthropy. But that's not it either. What we're really talking about is how to create value for society by simultaneously creating value for business. And Carolyn and some of the previous speakers already did some of my work for me by talking about shared value as an aspect of competitive strategy. And let me talk for a moment about what that really means and try and channel Professor Michael Porter, my colleague, if I can, who is known around the world for his work on strategy. As Carolyn said, there are a lot of companies who say our strategy is to be the best. But there is no best, because there are many different kinds of customers, and each customer has a somewhat different set of needs. And if you try and serve everybody, you'll have a very mediocre product. And if you try and compete with others in your industry by offering the same product or service, not doing anything differently, all you can do is compete on price by trying to lower your price. And then your competitor will lower his price. And maybe you can squeeze your employees' wages, or you can take other shortcuts, or you can call up a minister and offer a bribe, as was described. But those are not sustainable competitive advantages. A really sustainable competitive advantage comes from picking the particular customer segment you want to serve and designing every activity in your organization to serve their needs better than anyone else. And if you do that, you can have a sustainable competitive advantage that creates greater profit. Because your competitor, who's trying to serve other people, will have to make trade-offs, will have to give up some of what he's doing to serve other people if he's trying to compete with you. And so this idea that doing something different from others, finding a different market to serve a different need to meet, is the essence of sustainable competitive advantage. Now, how does that relate to social issues, to environmental issues? Well, it turns out that most businesses operate on business models that were developed decades or centuries ago. The idea of banking arose hundreds of years ago in Italy to serve merchants, and then was expanded in the UK. But it was always about serving the affluent and serving big customers. And every aspect of banking was designed that way. And you can look at industry after industry after industry, and every one of them was designed to serve well-off people in developed markets. And those models don't work for most of the world's population. Those models don't work if we want to try and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Those models don't work if we want to reduce carbon emissions and have a better environment. Because nobody thought about those issues when they designed those business models. And what Professor Porter and I have tried to focus on is this idea that addressing social needs, taking into account environmental impact, helping to achieve sustainable development goals, offer whole new areas of differentiation for companies, whole new business models that can achieve superior profitability, whole new avenues for competitive strategy. And so we believe that there is a synergy between greater opportunity for business and greater opportunity for society. That so much of what we see as social and environmental problems are actually the most promising business opportunities we have in the coming decades. Now, it seems obvious and simple to say this, but as we talk to different companies and work with different companies around the world, we find that there is this deep divide between the social sector and the business sector. And each sector thinks the other one is the problem. And if people are talking about doing good, solving a social problem, they feel they shouldn't be making money. They should be doing it for charity, out of the goodness of their heart. And if someone is trying to build a profitable business, he shouldn't be worrying about social impact and social problems. That's up to government and the social sector. But the reality is that that division is false. And that division is holding us back from achieving the kind of progress we can achieve both in business and in society. What are some examples? Well, I talked about banking being developed for the affluent in developed markets, that's the model of that business. But M-PESA as Safaricom is one of the world's best examples of creating shared value. It's not a charitable effort. It is rethinking financial services for much of the world's population that has no access to traditional banking, no need for traditional banking products, but can absolutely benefit from access to savings and credit. It can improve their lives and the lives of their families by having access to financial services. And it is a tremendously successful and profitable business that has really transformed much of the economy of this country for the better. And that ability to achieve scale is perhaps the greatest virtue of engaging business in solving social problems. Because when we try and help through philanthropy, we can help. But it turns out there's very few dollars. And so we can help only a few people. But if there is a solution to a social problem that is actually profitable, we can scale it up in a way that no philanthropy can. And we can build in innovation, we can take risk, we can drive efficiency in a way that typically governments around the world and nonprofits are not able to do. I'll give you a quick example. Nizioka talked about education and the importance of education. Well, we had the global shared value event just a few weeks ago in the US, and one of our speakers was a businessman from Peru, Carlos Rodriguez Pastor. And his company is called Intercorp. And he operates a number of different businesses, all of which are aimed at serving the emerging middle class in Peru. But he recognized that the educational system in Peru was terrible. It was toward the bottom of the world's educational systems. And there were private schools, but they were too expensive, and frankly, they weren't that good either. Now, he could have said, well, I'm going to address this problem through philanthropy. But instead, he said, I want to make this a business. And so he went around the world to study what are the best secondary educational schools. And he worked with world-class experts to design the Innova school system that was designed just for the needs of Peruvians, and designed in a way that helped the students learn what they needed to get the jobs that were available in Peru. He set up these schools. They're private schools. They cost about $100 a month, which most Peruvians can afford. And there are also scholarships for students who can't afford them. And the results of these schools has been phenomenal. They're in the top 25% of schools in the world. They're graduates from these poor, underprivileged backgrounds, in many cases on scholarship, can end up going to Oxford or Stanford or other outstanding universities. And the schools are profitable. He started with one school. It worked very well. It took about 2 or 3 years to achieve a profit, but it was able to achieve about a 20% profit. Very attractive. And as a result, he was able to open more schools. And today there are 40,000 kids in Peru in these schools. Next year there will be 100,000. And he doesn't have to stop there, because it is a profitable business model. He can access the capital and the talent he needs to grow it. And his ambition is nothing less than to create the school system for the country of Peru, and therefore advance the livelihoods and opportunity for Peruvians. So this is the power of engaging business in solving social problems by developing new business models that create a competitive advantage, that create value for the company, but also create value for society. And by looking around like M-PESA and finding new business models that meet the needs of most of the world's population. You know, there's another simple example I love. I wear glasses. When I need a prescription, I go to an optometrist to get it. Well, most of the world has no access to an optometrist. And a very bright young social entrepreneur said, if I have 2 lenses and they're mirror opposites of each other, and I put them together and align them perfectly, they're clear, there's no distortion. But if I begin to slide them apart, you actually get a stronger and stronger prescription. So I can make eyeglasses with double lenses and a little dial on the side. You don't need an optometrist, you just put the glasses on and turn the dial until you can see. Well, there are about 1 billion people in the world who need eyeglasses. And if you can't see, you can't work. And this simple invention is bringing better eyesight to millions of people, increasing their incomes by an average of 20%. And again, it can scale to the size of the world because it is a profitable business model. So when we talk about this idea of creating shared value, we think of it as happening at 3 levels. The first level is around developing new products or entering new markets and finding new ways to serve them, like M-PESA or like the eyeglass company Vision Spring. The second level is to rethink the activities in your value chain, the activities within your organization, to think about how you can create a more inclusive business, to how you can operate your business more profitably and more efficiently by having a healthier, more productive workforce, and by taking into account the environmental and social impacts of your activities. And it turns out that when you begin to think about that second level, you begin to think about your suppliers and your customers as well, and what you can do to help them. And there's a very interesting example in Latin America where Saab Miller, a beer company that sells much of its beer in Latin America through very small kiosks and mom and pop shops that operate, realized that those mom and pop shops were really struggling. They weren't earning a very good living. They were in danger of going out of business, and they weren't selling a whole lot of beer. And so they developed a corps of consultants that Saab Miller paid for to go out into communities and to teach retailing skills to these mom and pop stores, to help them understand their costs, their inventory control, to improve how they did lighting and arrange their displays and so on. And the result is a 50% increase in income for the families operating these stores, and correspondingly, a 30% increase in the sale of beer. It's created value for SAB Miller, and it's created value for the families that operate these kiosks around the countries. So thinking about how to not just accept the world as it is, with all of the limitations on your business because of poorly educated employees, because of inadequate health care, because of environmental impact, but instead to say, we can actually solve some of those problems, and if we can solve them, we'll improve the performance for our own company, our own shareholders, at the same time as we help society. You know, I love what Nizioka said about a fair profit and about not extorting too much profit. And certainly, it's hard to disagree that many pharmaceutical products are way overpriced, and unconscionably so. But I'll tell you, when I go to a business leader other than Bob, and say, you know, you ought to make less money, that conversation doesn't go very well. And even the most well-meaning CEO will tell me about the pressure he is under from his shareholders to meet those quarterly performance numbers, to sell more, to have higher profit than he had the year before. And it would be nice if he had a broader social vision, if every CEO of a major company was like Bob Collymore, I'd be out of a job. But we have to deal with the realities of business. And we have to recognize that if we want business to change, we have to show business why it is in their interest to change. And that is the power of shared value. So I mentioned that we think about shared value operating at 3 levels. The first is new products and markets. The second is rethinking the activities in your value chain and your suppliers and your customers. The third level is really about strengthening the communities that you're a part of. Because if your employees and customers are struggling, it's going to hold you back as a business. And I love the example Nizioka talked about in terms of coffee growers. And it reminded me of one of the cases I teach at Harvard Business School, which is on a Norwegian fertilizer company called Yara. It's a global fertilizer company, and it has made a specialty of working with smallholder farmers, color coding the different types of fertilizers so that even an illiterate farmer can understand which one works best for him, and providing all kinds of advice and technical support out in the field to help farmers use fertilizer better. And they were selling in Africa. They had a port of entry in Tanzania, but it was actually their worst performing market. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One, as we heard about, was corruption. The port was very corrupt. It took 6 months to get something out of the port if you didn't pay people off. But once you got it out of the port, there were no good roads to get out to the smallholder farmers in rural Tanzania. And even if you got to them, they had no access to financing or credit or money to buy fertilizer at the time that they needed it. And even if they bought fertilizer, they weren't very knowledgeable about how to use it well. And even if they were knowledgeable about how to use it well, there was no power, and therefore there was no irrigation. And you couldn't grow crops very well in this region without irrigation. And on and on and on. And of course, billions of dollars in international aid and philanthropy had gone in to try and solve these problems. And every one of those efforts did some good, but the problem was that every philanthropist, every international development agency focused on just one little piece of the problem. The World Bank would build a road, and that's great, but that didn't help the farmer unless he had irrigation. The Gates Foundation might come in and teach farmers better farming techniques, but unless the farmer had access to credit, he couldn't get better agricultural inputs. We live in a world where tremendous amounts of philanthropy and government aid are targeted on individual slivers of the complex, interrelated social problems we face. And if we can't tackle all aspects of the problem at once, we don't actually solve it. So Yara said, this could be a good market for us, but there are all these obstacles, and we can't solve this alone, we can't fix it. But we also can't wait for government. Government has its own priorities, and listening to the needs of very poor smallholder farmers in rural areas was not a high priority for government. But what Yara did is they brought together all of the different players who touched on this issue. 70 different private sector companies that each had an interest in agricultural development. Certainly the government and the Minister of Agriculture of Tanzania, certainly the World Bank and charitable foundations. And they got them all together and said, let's figure out what do we need to do to create a successful agricultural cluster for smallholder farmers in Tanzania? And let's figure out what sequence we have to do things in. Right? There's no point trying to put in irrigation until we've got power, etc. And so together, this group came up with a coherent plan for how to address all of the needs that were holding farmers back. It was a 2-decade-long plan, many billions of dollars. Yara put on only a small amount, 60 million, a very small amount of the many billions. But their real role was in leadership, in bringing the players together to help them develop a solution. And Yara couldn't lead this because if it was seen as a Yara initiative, the other companies wouldn't want to be part of it. The government wouldn't trust it. So they had to play a very unusual role for a company in bringing people together to collectively develop a solution without imposing their own agenda on it. But the result was there has been considerable success, even in 5 years. Farmer incomes are up by as much as 90%. And Yara has been rewarded too. Their sales of fertilizer in Tanzania have doubled. This went from being one of their worst performing markets to being one of their best. And it has created shared value. And the lesson, of course, is that companies cannot create shared value alone. If you're developing a new product, if you're developing a new model of banking, like M-PESA, yes, you can do that. But to really solve many of the social problems that are holding our communities and our countries back, you need to work together with NGOs and the social sector. You need to work together with government. Each has a different role that they can play. But it can be done in a way that serves the interest of business in creating greater profit. And by doing so, justifies the business investment and creates this opportunity for scale and growth. It seems like a very simple idea. And yet it really does require fundamentally rethinking our business models as companies, to say, where are the social issues that hold our business back? Where are the opportunities to reinvent a model to serve the world's population that we have ignored historically? And it turns out to be quite a challenge to get companies to think differently and to think that way. But it also turns out to be tremendously rewarding opportunity. I love the priorities in Kenya of the Big Four that we just heard about. They're exactly right. In each of them, I believe there are shared value strategies. that can enable the private sector to turbocharge the initiatives of government and to really create solutions. I'll give you one quick example. In India, the problem of affordable housing is a huge problem as well. Millions of people keep coming into the city every year, the major cities. They end up in slums, they can't afford housing. And of course, nobody really designed housing for low-income people. Developers build expensive housing because they'll make the most money that way. But an organization in India decided to develop really inexpensive housing, apartments that could be sold for a few $1,000s, but were nice apartments. It was very complicated. They had to work with architects and designers to come up with the models. They had to get variances in zoning because what they were trying to do wasn't officially permitted by government. And then they had to develop, they found a microfinance mortgage market, because even borrowing a few $1,000s, particularly for people who were in the informal economy, there was no vehicle to finance that. So they had to put all of these different pieces together, but the result now is 80,000 housing units and many more under construction. Because they are profitable, developers are finding that the demand for this is so great that people are willing to put the money up front before the building's even built, so the developer doesn't even need financing. It's turned out to be a tremendous business model. Just one more example of creating shared value. And I believe whether you're sitting here in business, or from government, or from civil society, there are opportunities to break down this division between business and society, to find profitable business opportunities, to support those and enhance those through philanthropic efforts, through the work of the social sector, through the work of government. Each of us, I believe, has a role to play in creating shared value. And if we begin to think this way, to uncover these opportunities, I think we will begin to see development activity and human progress and environmental progress, not just in Kenya, but across Africa and across the world. And doing that turns out to make every job much more fulfilling. When you know that the work you are doing is helping others, is making the world a better place, that is one powerful reward.